reported oil that they knew they could draw on as they needed, and they had a kind of comfortable position to let this in, and it was extraordinarily easy, really. It was not difficult to make money in such a situation. But then eventually this inventory was drawn down progressively, and they all fully realized that future discovery was falling. They could see the trend as now published by Exxon, see the decline in discovery from 1964 until now. They obviously weren't oblivious to this. And well, their first reaction was go to the last frontier, the deep water, drilling in 5, 6, 10,000 feet of water. There are only a few parts of the world that have the right geology even there. The oceans are deep over many areas, but there's only a few selected places, mainly in the Gulf of Mexico, off Brazil and off West Africa, that have the right geology. Anyway, they started doing that, and the fact they were willing to look in 10,000 feet of water tells you there wasn't anywhere else easier accessible. So there's another message. And they kept on in this way and continue even to this day to make optimistic noises about how we're running into oil, not out of it. This is a famous statement of BP. And then, just I would say in the last few years, you begin to detect, so to speak, the end of that particular chapter of trying to hide, if you like to put it bluntly, the essential nature of depletion. You have BP, for example, a couple of years ago changed its logo to a burst of sunshine, and the chairman said that BP now stood for Beyond Petroleum, and they started investing in solar energy and various alternative things. I think initially primarily as a public relations exercise, but also as a kind of position to take in relation to the investment community, because in the modern age everybody has to sing to the investment community. And so if the investment community would say, well, just how much are you finding, and a few delicate questions of this sort, they could say, well, you know, we are an energy company now, they like to say. We're no longer oil. Well, yes, oil, this is useful, of course, but we are moving on to gas, and then when gas is gone, well, we've got solar, and then we're into biomass in Bolivia, and you know, this was a sort of happy way to evade the issue of the underlying depletion of their principal asset, of which they depend. So this was imagery, you could say. And I would say some of them even believed their own imagery, probably. You know, it's not entirely cynical public relations. It was, you know, some people can think this way too. But then even this sort of ran its course, and you had this merger that began to take place. The first was Gulf Oil, that had a corporate raider, Boone Pickens, the famous Boone Pickens, who saw this moribund, inbred management of Gulf Oil with the company jet taking the president's wife's dog to the vet and this kind of behavior. And he interceded here and made a sort of bid for Gulf because he would become a major shareholder of it. And of course the major companies joined ranks at that point. They couldn't bear this to happen, and so Chevron bought Gulf out, solved that little problem, because the oil companies don't like any kind of chink in the image of the fact that they're on top of everything and they're in control, and whatever happens we are going to deal with it. That's what they like to present. So Gulf was the first to go to Chevron. And then Amoco, Standard Oil of Indiana, as it used to be, Pan American, a big US domestic company, it was bought out by BP, and that was the next one to go. Then, and then the Europeans consolidated. Total Elf of France and Fina of Belgium got together. Then more recently, Chevron Texaco has merged. So whereas you once had these 7, and now finally ExxonMobil, so whereas you previously had 7 major oil companies, you now only have 4. Shell is the only one to remain in splendid isolation, so to speak, who has not gone down this merge, or even now it's bought a small company, Enterprise, just the other day for its reserves. That's an interesting thing too. It bought Enterprise, and Enterprise had nothing but some reserves in the North Sea, effectively given to it by Mrs. Thatcher at that time, and they paid quite a lot for this company. And so the fact that they're willing to buy reserves on the stock market, actually it debased the common value of their portfolio of reserves to add this expensive reserves later. So that gave you a little message that they needed some more reserves. And they were under criticism from the investment community, who were saying they weren't doing enough in exploration and production to offset the declining production. And then when you look at the result of these merged companies, you will end up finding that the staff is still the same as half of the staff has been let go. You find enormous amount of outsourcing and contracting out. In fact, I think BP has officially said it would like to contract out on short-term basis about 30% of its workforce. Well, this tells you that they don't want the commitment of employing these people for a very long time. The combined budgets are slashed, and so I think that the net result of this is a downsizing. I can't, of course, say it in so many words, but that's what it amounts to. And I also noticed that there's very little investment in refineries. So if production was set to rise, as some of the imagery would have us believe, you would wonder why they weren't building some refineries to process this stuff. And so I think we can see that the major oil companies are declining. I think they recognize that themselves internally. And they will go into perhaps what started as just public relations becomes more real as the need for it increases, and as nature imposes on them the decline of their principal past assets, they've got to do something else, or else they just wither away and I would say in a sense they are already withering away into what you could call it financial institutions rather than old-fashioned oil companies with spanners and hammers in their hands. What they say and what they do is not quite the same. You get this bland kind of imagery that they like to put out, and it's very hard to say whether this is quite deliberate or whether it's mindset or what it is. But, for example, Lord Brown, the chairman of BP, at the Davos meeting a couple of years ago, said he expected oil production to reach a maximum around 210, and it would begin to run out 40, 50 years after that. Well, the impression left with his audience was that, well, the maximum would be reached and they would have this happy plateau until it began to sort of fade away 40, 50 years far beyond anybody's concern. Well, what he was actually saying is it would reach a peak and begin to decline in 210. And he didn't exactly say that. So it's a clever choice of words. When people choose their words with such care, it gives you the impression they do so deliberately, and therefore they know what they're trying to do. It's not just an accident. But I know a lot of sort of glib words are said all over the place. Challenge is a great word they like to use, and so on. And in this latest statement by Exxon, he says that having depicted the declining discovery, he says, well, we face a big challenge to meet demand by 2010. Oh, I should say also that we've only spoken of the major international oil companies. Of course, there are huge numbers of smaller oil companies, and they too are merging, and the contracting business is contracting. In fact, this is a certain constraint, because with this outsourcing of everything, the industry, the oil companies now rely heavily on the contractors to supply rigs and offshore equipment and so on, and the contracting business has little knowledge of the true nature of this long-term situation, so they often make mistakes in overbuilding or underbuilding or whatever. So it's hard to foresee the direction of the oil companies, but after all, we're not running out of oil, as we've already discussed. There's about as much left as we've used already, so there's a considerable role for the industry into the future, producing, and they'll need every skill they can marshal to take on ever more difficult projects and the slower production of the heavy oil and all these things. So there's certainly a future for the oil companies, but a rather different style of thing from what they have known in the past.
Why is the price of oil so unstable and unpredictable?
You see, the price of oil, apart from the early huge fluctuations before it was kind of brought under control by Rockefeller and the various instruments, Standard Oil and the Texas Railroad Commission and eventually OPEC, was very stable for about 30 years, from 1930 till 1973. The oil traded over this long period $2 to $3 a barrel.